How did you first get interested in bikes?
Bikes, that's a difficult one.
I suppose I should have said motorbikes, sorry.
Motorbikes. I mean, two things we've all got in common. Everybody in this room is of a certain age, and everybody's got some sort of addiction or connection to motorcycle sport. And that's very true of me. I grew up with a brother that rode trials and motocross because we lived in Hall Green, Birmingham. And there was Richard Crofts. Anybody heard of Richard Crofts? He was a useful dot rider and sponsored by Van Onslow. So I grew up watching motocross, the likes of Hawkston Park and local centre meetings. And my local hero was Ernie Greer. From that moment on, at age about 10, I wanted to be Ernie Greer. Dave Bickers was out of reach. I knew that even at that young age. But I got involved through my brother riding. He rode Tiger Cub in trials and a Dot and then a Greaves in scrambles. So that's how it started.
And then I think in your early days you got an apprenticeship at BSA, didn't you?
Yeah, like George Greenland, I wasn't great at school either. I mean, Billy Connolly had a sort of a sketch where he said, you know, who's ever used algebra since they left school, you know? One B is B, two B's is a couple of B's, who gives a shit? And I sympathise with that completely, I've never used it. So I left school quite early and I got the offer of an apprenticeship at BSA a week after my 16th birthday. So I've got to get there, so I borrowed my brother's small-wheeled road-going Tiger Cub, took my bike tests and passed my bike tests, and then started at BSA. But I was unusual because I was 6 months ahead of their annual intake of apprentices. They take the apprentices in September, just like a college or a uni would. So they put me to work in the factory straight away. So I was sort of stood there operating capstans and drilling machines and things in jigs for like £3 a week. And it was like slave labour in this sort of vast factory which sort of stank of suds and cutting wheels, and you're buried in swarf, and labourers would come round with an airline and blow all the swarf off. It was like being shot glass, you know. It was a pretty grim environment. But the training school for apprentices was very good, and you learned all the basic skills. You know, we were working to within 0.002 of an inch, which is the thickness of a human hair, you know, and tradesmen these days, you're lucky if they can work within 1/4 of an inch. In fact, everything's metric now and it's got even worse. So the factory was interesting, to say the least. And as an apprentice, I used to get all the jobs of go off to the tool stores and get a certain size drill or reamer, and you could disappear for like 3 or 4 hours and nobody knew where you were. And in the middle of the factory, it was like an internal scrapyard. So all the old bits that had been rejected off the production lines, it could be Amel carburettors, it could be a mixture of nuts and bolts, it could be, you'd fill your pockets full of nuts and bolts, go back to the training school and sort of empty them all into your lunchbox. There was more stuff going out of that factory via the back door than there was going in dealers' showrooms. You know, you'd see a guy walking with a limp out of the factory, and you'd think, what's he done to himself? He's got a fork leg down the straight. Next day he's walking with a limp with another leg. So there was a lot going on. The lucky few had legitimate access. You know, if you worked in the comp shop or the experimental department, which quite a few of the known riders did, you had legitimate access to engine parts and whatever, and they would sort of pass them on to mates. But there was an awful lot of stuff that went out the wrong way. One incident that happened with me and Mick Bowers was I'd got an L-Star Cub at the time, and the ignition systems weren't great, and I was running on a 6-volt system with a little Honda 50 battery. Well, I said to Bonky one lunchtime, I says, can you get me some of this new 12-volt capacity discharge stuff that they started to fit on the road bikes? It got all sorts of complex bits like Zener diodes and things. Anyway, he must have gone around the factory with a cardboard box and collected all the items. But what he did, he took it in the training school, he gave it to the storeman and said, this is for Steve Wilson. a box full of electrical stuff, and the storeman took it straight to the boss of the training school, and he got me in the office, and his office was like a lookout tower at a prisoner of war camp, you know. That's where you got for your serious bollockins if you'd done something wrong. He's like, what's this box of bits all about? I says, well, they wanted to try it on a trials bike, you know, and Bonky's giving it to me, but I was sort of stuck with what to say, and anyway, I never ever got the 12-volt stuff on a bike. So there were lots of things like that.
And what about your experiences at Elstar then?
Well, after I left BSA, I left 1970 before it really got into trouble. I went to work for Alf Ellis, who was a grass strap company owner. So I got the experience of bending tubes and actually putting frames together, which I hadn't had at BSA. BSA, you were very restricted on what you did. He sadly died after about a year. I think he'd been to a long track meeting or a grass track meeting in Germany. Driving back overnight, he obviously fell asleep at the wheel, and he basically just died in a ditch. They never found him, and I think he just bled to death. So that was Alf Ellis. By the time I worked there, a Birmingham dealer called Bob Joyner had bought it, and he was a bit of an entrepreneur. He would go and buy bankrupt stock for things like Bond bugs and all sorts of odd vehicles, and then he'd have a fire and claim all the insurance on it. So he was a bit risky, but the guy I met there who was absolutely brilliant was a guy called Colin Saunders. Now, nobody probably here will have heard of Colin Saunders. He did the engines for Chris Baybutt's grass trap bikes. They were running coal engines, which were made in the Midlands by a speedway rider called Howard Cole. And he also worked with Peter Hull way back in Huntingdon, I think, and did his engines for motocross, and he had good connections with Eric Cheney. I learnt an awful lot of Colin Saunders, and I then built 2 Cheney BSAs. But the other Elstar story is I built a Bantam in our lunch times at the factory, and Bob Joyner knew nothing about it, and I used, you know, their REH hubs and 1 or 2 bits, and we just built it with some help, because I've never built a frame in my life. My Bantam engine, which somehow came from BSA, and I finished it, and Bob Joyner says, where's this come from? What is it? Alf Ellis was still alive. He was chuffed to bits with it. And Bob Joyner says, you can't ride that. You haven't paid for it. You've done this in our work's time. Anyway, I couldn't ride it. So what Alf did, he went to Val Onslow's and said, Steve's built this fantastic little Bantam, but Bob Joyner wants money for it. Will you help us out? And Onslow's paid for it so that I could ride it. And I had a little bit of success in centre trials with it, but that was about it. So that's the All-Star story.
Brilliant. By the way, can everybody hear Steve at the back? Yeah? All
sure.
good? Right, moving on to how did the Speedway job come about?
Oh. We've got to bring in a second red-headed tall brummie now, Arthur Browning, right? People used to think we were brothers because we were both tall, we both had red hair, we both got very tiny sets of parents, which was really unique. You know, all our parents were 5 foot nothing, and we were 6 foot-ish, right? So I got to know Arthur Browning through a bit of trials practice with him, and I used to go to Wakely Ward. Well, actually, it was Highland Crow at the time, Bunny Ward shop. And mixing with the top guys, it kind of rubs off on you. It makes you a lot more confident and braver, and your skills improve through mixing with them. So Arthur just started at Birmingham Speedway, returned to the old Perry Bar in 1971. He was coming to the end of his good scrambles career. I think he'd finished with Greaves and was running AJS, but he was in decline on the scrambles route. So Arthur was an instant hit at Birmingham Speedway. I mean, he had the biggest wingspan and the sharpest elbows you're ever going to meet on the corner. So by the second year, 1972, he says, come along to the press day, because Speedway, unlike any other motorsport, you get 0 practice. Away tracks, no practice. You get the press day at your home circuit, and you get a few laps in and a few photographs taken, and that's it for the year, no practice. So he put me on the bike at the press day. I got the one corner made up quite well, it's like that, a second one not so well, but they obviously thought I was promising, and some people seem to assume I was an ex-grass tracker, but I think I'd done 3 ever on Borrell Stars. So the next week they put me in the second half heat. I've never done any practice starts, so I'm sort of bent over it, revving with the other arm. Tapes go up and I go rip, straight off the back, just looped it, and it just dumped me in the track. And that was on Harry Bastle's son's bike, so we had to straighten that out. And then it went from there, and I struggled the first year to get in the team, but by 73 I was a full-time member of the team, and that's basically how it came about.
Do you have any major crashes in your Speedway career or not?
The thing with Speedway, unlike scrambles, when you fall off a motocross bike, it's generally your fault and you slide under the ropes. When you fall off a Speedway bike, it's usually because you're caught up in somebody else's accident. And back in the day, they were either inside dog tracks, so you've got these floodlit lamp standards and like a mesh fence with a kickboard, so you either got tangled up in the fence and ended up in a heap, or the away tracks, sometimes they were around rugby fields, and they'd be solid boards, so people would come diving underneath you without a hope in hell of getting around the corner, take your leg away, and the whole lot of you would just go into the fence, you know. There were no airbags in those days, so it was a bit dangerous.
You had to use other riders as brakes, in other words.
Yeah.
Right, what about a bit of a report on your Saracen days?
Yeah, that came about by accident. I'd started scrambling in 71 fairly seriously and built some Cheney BSAs, but I wanted to ride the Scottish. I'd done the Scottish the year before on a Montesa, which was my first one. And I was in Onslow's one day and there was a second-hand Saracen in the show, and I said, "Can I borrow that, Peter, to ride a centre trial?" They let me have the bike. I won the centre trial, and I think I went to Gloucestershire and beat Jack Galloway, John Bliss, the Davises on the Saracen home turf, which made them then ring up Val Onslow and said, would you make up the 3rd member of a Scottish 6-day team? So I did that and sort of rushed around the Scottish. But the funny story of that week is mine was kind of worn out, the engine, whereas John Bliss and Jack Galloway had brand new bikes, and Jack finished an absolutely brilliant 8th in the Scottish. But I hold the record, I think, of losing the most marks on Town Hall Bray in one go. And what happened, Town Hall Bray is really easy, but it was 2 subsections, and I sort of rushed at it in 3rd gear, I didn't even looked at it, and it gassed up in the first section, so I started to foot it and slip the clutch to try and get it to recover. I got into the 2nd sub and it just stopped. So 8 marks on Town Hall Bray for a works rider. So that was quite embarrassing. The good point was I managed to wrestle it up pipeline clean and just sort of literally 2nd gear start, dropped it down to 1st when it starts to dig in on pipeline, and just managed to wrestle it to the top. And the boss was so impressed, he bought us all a meal that week in Fort William, and he's had really good press photos taken, which is the one that's circulating now with the 3 red Saracens in the car park. So that's basically the Saracen story. Apart from, do you want to move on to the Enduro tale?
Yeah.
Right. As a result of that, the next year, 1972, David Brand and Saracen approached me and Mick Bonky Bowers. He said, "How would you like to ride the Welsh 2-day?" which is an Enduro. It used to be a 3-day, didn't it? So we both agreed. We'd never seen the bikes, and they arrived in Rhayader, or Landrindod, and they got massive speedos on, a massive bulb horn and cables everywhere, so they're a bit untidy, but the basic bike was quite good. So off we go day 1. Halfway around, Bonky's lost his chain in a ditch, never found it. So Bonky's out. Day 2, they let Bonky restart, and he followed me around, and my head at the time said, surely you've got to go flat out through everything, you know, every section, every time jet. So I'm fast forest track, I've got it sliding in a left-hander, which turned out to be a right-hander. So I go straight into a ditch, land on my head in a pile of logs. Bonky comes along, whips my helmet off, but nicks my ear, so my ear's bleeding. They're thinking, oh, serious. Andy Robertson comes along and says, do you want an ambulance? But we managed to limp out of there. I'd hurt my shoulder and I was concussed. So Bonky and the others went to the presentation that night while I sort of slept it off on somebody's couch, you know, concussed and never went near a hospital. Which, again, you wouldn't treat people like that today.
And you obviously had a great association with Vale Onslow, didn't you?
Yeah, through the initial Saracen connection. I mean, Vale Onslow's was a vast business in the 60s. You could turn up outside their shop on the Stratford Road in Birmingham. There would be queues around the block, and you could go in there, and when you finally got to the counter, which could take an hour, hour and a half, and they were selling, you know, road bike spares for Gold Stars, Triumph Bonnevilles, anything you name. And this is a comparison with modern life now. You could go to Len and say, I want a camshaft bush for a Tiger Cup, and he'd go, oh, that's a ZO31P. Off to the bin, come back with the bush, you know, £2.50, you pay with cash, you walk out, right? You go in a modern motor factors now, you say, I want a 17-inch wiper blade, and they go, what's the registration number? And I feel like saying, my eyes are greeny blue, what else do you need to know? And that's the modern world, and you pay with a card, and it takes them half an hour to print the bloody receipts off. And we've made progress, really. So, Vale Onslow's was vast. Anyway, I was quite privileged. I could go in there and dig round the cellar for bits and pieces, and we made some quite special bikes while I was there.
And what about Mr. Bowers and the Bonky days? Yeah,
the Bonky days. He, like everybody else, when BSA folded in the early 70s, had to think of something else to do. So he opened up a motorcycle shop in Studley in Warwickshire and was sort of main agents for Ossa, Bultaco eventually, and obviously some road bike brands. And after I'll tell you what happened at the end of the Vale Onslow thing, actually. I'd built a special Bantam for trials, which I rode, until the Ossa came along. But I'd got loads of bikes of Onslow's. I'd got a grass track bike, ice racing bike, trolls bike, God knows what. Len Senior, old man Onslow, who went on to be Britain's oldest working man at about 100, he wanted the Bantam trials bike back so he could ride it in the Greybeards, would it be? Yeah. Anyway, I hadn't had time to put it back together because I'd stripped it to take the special trials gears out to do the ice racing, which we'll have to cover later. So because I hadn't returned it, I was busy with the Speedway and just hadn't had time. He sent somebody around with a letter and reclaimed all the bikes. So suddenly I was completely bikeless. And Bonky came to the rescue. He says, well, borrow my Ossa for the Manx 2 day, which I did, and I think I finished third behind Sammy Miller and Paul England. And then I built my own special Ossa after that. I had a brand new bike off Bonky at cost price, stripped it, decided the bits I didn't like, which was the frame and the back wheel, and made a brand new frame as L-Star, which I had sort of chrome plated. It was sort of lightweight CDS tubing. And I put an REH rear wheel in it, which was a nice small conical hub, because I didn't like the Ossa hub very well. And then I rode that, and I had some really good success on that. I think I was 4th in the British Experts and 4th in lots of consecutive nationals. But I was unlucky that those consecutive nationals weren't part of the British Championship rounds. So I did reasonably well, but not as well as I would have liked.
Can we have a little potted bit about your bull tackle career?
Yeah. After the success of 72, Jock Wilson approached me through Bonky and said, would you like to come and ride for us? It's just Bull Taco UK. Initially I turned it down, and then I had a change of heart and agreed to ride for Bull Taco from 73. So I rode for Bull Taco UK from 1973 right through till the end of 1979. I think I was with them for 7 years. So, a lot of good years there, quite a bit of success. I think 9th in the British Championship for 3 different years, but never quite managing to break through that top 3, you know, that sort of rat, shepherd, mark dominance. But nearly always in the top 10, and a really great period on bull tacos.
And then, how did the BMX thing start then? Because that's obviously a story on its own, isn't it? Completely by accident. I mean, my last year of trials was on an SWM for Mick Bowers and Jock Wilson. That ended with a little bit of a dispute over the contract and the bike ownership. But what I used to do on a Monday was go and practice in a river to make washing my bike easier. You know, you softened all the mud up from the day before on the tyre, and you could go and wash it. Well, this particular day, I rode towards Halford's head office, and there was a guy building Reddish's BMX track, which was going to be the first commercially used BMX track in the whole country, you know, in 1980. And just through being in the right place at the right time, I met this guy, and he introduced me to Halford's, and a really good working relationship happened after that, with me making BMX bicycles and running a race team for Halford. So I got the luxury of Halford's funding my bikes and going around the country with a group of lads doing an exciting new sport, you know, which didn't exist when we were all youngsters. I mean, everybody would probably have been playing on push bikes before they took to motorcycles. And that was a very lucrative 6 years with Halford's with the BMX. This chap's got to take some of the blame for the modern trials where they hop up over 9-foot flat-faced skips and things, you know. Yeah, when the cycling trials started in, I think it was 82, I built a couple of special bikes. One was for Scott Dommett, who was 14 at the time. He went on to become British champion on that bike, and another lad in the Midlands, so we sort of started travelling. What introduced me to Cornwall in a way. I used to come down to Collins and out at St Agnes. What's the name of the mine out that way? Blue Hills. Yeah. Cyclotron in there. So that introduced me to Cornwall. And now I'm an illegal immigrant trying to learn the language. And I didn't come on a boat. I actually think Mr. Luckett's done an extremely good job on you. You speak much better than your friend here, Mr. Burt. I can't quite understand Johnny Luckett over there. Right. Has anybody got any questions for Steve before he starts writing his book?
Did you tell us about the ice racing?
No, I didn't tell you about the ice racing. That was a sort of spin-off from Harry Bastable. He had the bright idea, along with a guy called Alan Lyons, that they would run indoor ice racing on ice rinks, you know, commercial ice rinks, on BSA Bantam-powered rigid bikes. Rob Homer made the frames. Who remembers Rob Homer? Yeah. So Rob Homer made the frames. I put the special alloy barrel Bantam engine in mine, so it screamed like hell. And I'm going to be big-headed now. I'm going to say at ice racing, I think I was potentially the best.
Better than Adrian Moss?
Yeah, way better than Adrian Moss. I could ride a lap feet up, but my problem was, once people had seen me practice feet up going in, I was a marked man, I was a target. So they'd all come diving out. I ended up in the barriers more times than I ended up on the track. Because we went to Scotland and took on Glasgow, which is a rough old place anyway, isn't it, Glasgow? And it was like warfare. I think the referee had to sort of find people and calm stuff down, because everybody was cutting the corners to get underneath each other. And they were on Greaves Pathfinders, which were slower out of the gate. I mean, the Bantams got the jump out of the gate, but once the Pathfinders got going, they were so much heavier, they just barged us out of the way. It was like Skittles. And I was a marked man, believe me. But I honestly think I was the quickest round single laps. Well, any more questions for Steve?
Yeah, tell us about the special tackle that you...
the tanker, yeah. I'm particularly proud of that bike. John Collins owns it now in South Wales. It's still survived after 40-odd years, and I think that's my legacy to trials. I think the thinking at the time was that The Spanish bikes, great though they were a bit bulky up top. So the tank got in the way when you were really footing hard. And it struck me when washing bikes several times a week, there was never any mud up near the steering head under the tank. And there was loads of mud under that mud guard where the air filter was. So I just thought, swap positions, it's obvious. So I built a Bultaco, I'd already got a frame jig. The top tube that acted as a filler tube. The main fuel tank was where the airbox usually is, so I got, I think, 8 pints in there. And I put the air filter up around the steering head. And it worked. It worked. It gave you more space, it lowered the centre of gravity, it put the weight of a gallon of petrol much closer to the back tyre. But I had to get permission off Comforts to ride it. They weren't overly keen to start with, because I was trying to describe it on the telephone. But it worked. And if you did it today, and some of the modern bikes obviously got fuel injection, fuel pumps and a lot more technology, it was the way to go.
Sounds like a very logical place to put the air filter, if you ask me. Anyway, as we've done a cracking job, Stevie, we've also run over 10 minutes. We're now running 20 minutes late. And I know there's several people here who are due to go and have a nap. So, Leggy over there was dropping off just now, I was watching him. So I think you should think seriously about writing your book, because just don't forget, for you who can, go on Charles Guru, and there's a super article on Steve in that, and that's really worth a read. But that's the forerunner to his book.
No, I'm not doing a book. I said to John Moffat, this has taken 5 years, and it really did. I said, you scroll down, it's a bit like going down a toilet roll. I says, John, it goes on forever and it's full of crap. But he had a sense of humour.
Will you please put your hands together and give an enormous round of applause?